Um, oop, we are starting to record. Okay. Hello, everybody. My name is Julia Scott, and I am with Baltimore Racial Justice Action. And I want to thank you for taking time on this lovely, snowy Sunday for our 13th of the month event, which is about underreported current events. So, next slide for me, please. So before we get started, I want to make sure that folks know, as this is a virtual event, get a beverage or a snack during our time today. Keep your laptop charger close by. Get some paper and some pen ready in case you have any notes or you want to ask any questions before we get to the audience. Set aside anything that might distract you, and please make sure that you mute yourself until the moderator or panelist asks you to unmute. Next slide. If this is one of your first events, or this is, of course, another, like your fifth, it doesn't matter. We want you to follow us on social media. We do have an Instagram and a Twitter. You can follow us at Be More Anti-Racist. You can find us on Facebook at Baltimore Racial Justice Action, and we are on YouTube. So we're going to put this event as well as our past 13 events are on our YouTube channel. So looking up Baltimore Racial Justice Action, and please follow us. So a little bit about us. We are a network of Maryland individuals that are committed to social transformation. We emphasize racial equity. We were founded in 2003, and we've had our roots in the Agents of Change workshops that began in 1996. We are a program of Fusion Partnerships, Incorporated, which is a 501c3 nonprofit organization. The work that we do is we do workshop series for members of the public. We consult for organizations, and of course, we offer free monthly dialogue events like this one. And you can learn more about our public workshops, our consultation, our 13th of the month events if you visit our website at bemoreantiracist.org. And so we can continue to do this awesome work, please visit us at bemoreantiracist.org/donate. Just in the donation, you can sign up for various sections of it. You can either be a monthly sustainer, so doing monthly donations, sustain the work that we do, and you can also just donate what you can. This allows us to continue to offer free monthly events and to support the work that we're doing in our community. And also, this is a content and recording advisory. Given the historic and violent nature of racism in this country and how it's been perpetuated on Black and non-Black people of color, an examination of history will be challenging. So because of this, BRJA provides this content warning at the beginning of our workshops and public offerings. Because of the U.S. history of violence against Black and non-Black people of color, these conversations might surface for you moments of discomfort, pain, and struggle with the contents. You are encouraged to take care of yourself during that time in ways that do not disrupt the work or these sessions for others. So please take a moment and assess whether you're emotionally ready to participate at this time. We would like to remind you that our 13th of the month events are recorded and posted on our social media platforms. So without further ado, I'm going to send it to Anthony, who is going to do our introduction.
Thank you, and hello, everyone. Appreciate seeing some familiar faces and looks like some new folks. And maybe you came today because you're like, hey, I like this specific topic. And I know that we have some of our longtime followers and attendees that are like, it doesn't matter what the topic is, I'll just be here. And so I wanted to read to get us started a little bit about the event for those who did not see the flyer, because I think this description really hits it on. The summer 2020 uprising forced news outlets to provide primetime coverage to confront the racial disparities and everlasting unrest that exist in our country. In the months following the summer of global protests, media zeroed in on the presidential elections, the insurrection, and the trial of a few Black people murdered by police. While these moments were momentous and crucial to racial justice movement work, they often overshadow the other phenomenal organizing advancements and the ludicrous injustices that we treated as business per usual. Today, we are reviewing underreported current events that did not touch down on your favorite social media timeline or didn't have sufficient coverage on your 5 o'clock news. We recognize that there are tons of news stories that aren't receiving the spotlight that they deserve. And this afternoon, we're only covering about 3 stories. We intend on repeating this event. And so we ask that you look out for that. We may even on our social media ask, hey, what would you like to see covered in this repeat of this event for future, which might be fall-ish when that repeats. I just want to give a little bit of a layout on how today's event is going to go. Each of our panelists has a topic, current event that they are going to summarize. And then there's going to be some crosstalk with our panelists. We ask that while we're on a specific topic, you may be like, ooh, this is a point that I want to bring up or a question that I have. We ask that you hold that. So have your pen, have your paper ready, go ahead and write it down. We'll go through all 3 of the news topics. And then we're going to have time for Q&A where we can all kind of have large group crosstalk about the 3 topics. And I just also want to let you know that everyone that we have on the panel are not experts, right? That we are all learning together. And so that's also time in the Q&A for you to be like, oh, this is a topic that I know some more about. Let me share some more details maybe, or I have more questions about a thing as I'm processing and saw it reported in a different way. And so I just also want to give space to that we are not the experts with all the answers. We are all curious learners that are looking through this with a racial justice lens and sharing this time together and this learning experience together. So I want us to take a couple of breaths. We're going to do a little bit of kind of grounding. You can close your eyes if you would like. I want you to think about how you ingest your news. Where does it usually come from? How often do you get it? What time of day? Are you ingesting your news with your coffee and orange juice for breakfast? Are you opting into it, or are you just going on your timeline and it's just there in your face and then you go down a rabbit hole? Are you getting your news over dinner time with your family? And what are you doing when you're receiving that news? Are you asking more questions? Does it strike more conversation? Do you shrug it off? And let's go ahead and open our eyes. Now, we all know that, news likes to put in some good stuff. It's hard to find some actual good news. But oftentimes when we're talking about the racial injustices, especially that we see in the news, we see people of color fighting for land, voting rights, health rights. And most of the times those news coverage stories are about 30 seconds to a minute. And then it's move on to the next story, right? And so while we have a ritual of the way that maybe we intake our news, it is also building for us a ritual of there's about a minute of your day on this, and then we move on as business per usual, right? We see a Black person murdered by police, and then they move on as business per usual. We see Native people fighting and defending their land and being hosed and tear gas, and move on to the next story as business per usual. Kids put in cages, and the next story, business per usual, right? And so I want to start by congratulating everybody for being here, because we're taking time to stop and examine things and not just move as business per usual. In our time together, we are asking questions, we're examining closely this news that we're getting small sound bites from, and looking at it in a deeper way and using our racial justice lens. Oftentimes we're talking about what is the action step or what is the thing that we should be doing. This is very much the action that we should be doing, is asking the deeper questions and giving it the time and the breath that these injustices that are occurring in our life deserve to have. Next, I want to give love, respect, and honor to journalists and resistors who have risked their lives and their careers to give us the real news that it is that we need to hear, right? It wasn't just in the mid-2010s when fake news popped up. It's been happening ever since America has been America, right? And doing that job is not easy and comes at a cost. And so I want to give respect and love to those journalists that have done that. And then also, while we're talking about this and critiquing the way that news is given to us and that we digest it, and there's so many outlets that are doing it incorrectly, want to give love and praise to the ones that are doing it well, the ones that are pushing back, the ones that are trying to provide it to us in a way that is outside or pushing back on the anti-Black norms and the white supremacy culture norms. And so we want to honor and hold that as well. So let's give a couple more breaths. And let's come back into the room. So we have an exciting conversation for us today, and have three phenomenal panelists. And I'm gonna let our panelists introduce themselves. I'm gonna start off with you, Tammy.
Wow, phenomenal, Anthony, thank you. Hard to live up to. My name is Tammy Safran. I am an attorney that works with public defenders in Washington, D.C. I am a Baltimore resident and have lived here nearly 15 years, and mother of 3 kids who are older elementary and middle school aged.
Okay, Betsy.
My name's Betsy. My pronouns are she, hers, and I attended the first BRJA workshop class ever held in 2005, and then was a member of BRJA from 2006 to 2010. And I now live in Chicago. I'm active in some organizations here, but I'm excited to be able to connect with BRJA virtually. And professionally, I'm a midwife, and I work at a clinic called Chicago Women's Health Center.
Nice. And Julia, who you've heard from earlier, but as panelists.
Yeah. Hi, everybody. My name is Julia. I work with BRJA as a trainer, but also as a co-coordinator of the 13th of the month events. So along with Michelle, another BRJA member, we put these events on monthly. I am born and raised Baltimore City, Northeast, and I am a proud Hbcu graduate, as well as I work at the University of Maryland doing, DEI work. So that is a little bit about me.
Thank you. And I forgot to introduce myself. I am Anthony, co-director of Baltimore Racial Justice Action. On the public service side is where my focus is, and Adar Ayira, who many of you know, is our co-director for our contract services. Lived in Baltimore for about 10 years, and then in August moved to Atlanta. And so Julia, when you gave the hey, snowy day, I was like, oh shoot, I'm missing it. I forgot that y'all were getting some snow today. So that's the beautiful thing of Zoom, that we can all be together in the same room. So let's hop into this. Like I said, we have 3 stories that we could talk about for hours. But we don't have hours and hours to talk about it, so let's hop into it. And we're going to start off with I think it's Tammy. Are you first? Yes, Tammy.
It is. Thanks, Anthony. I'm going to talk a little bit about excited delirium. Like Anthony said, none of us is expert. I certainly am not. I was turned on to this term right after George Floyd's murder a year and a half ago, 2 years ago. So I want to give a quick summary of some salient points about the concept that I think would be helpful and that I found very helpful. I'll start with a definition from the literature. Potentially fatal state of extreme agitation and delirium, often combined with aggressive behavior, tolerance to pain, extreme physical strength and endurance, and hyperthermia, so elevated temperature. What it really is a pseudo condition that pathologizes the psychological and biological response to police violence to insulate police and weapons manufacturers from liability when folks die in custody. You'll see on the slide here a bit of drapetomania and then a bit about excited delirium. Delirium was first, the phrase was first coined back in the mid 1800s, working with insane folks at McLean Hospital in Boston. And it sort of had excited tagged onto it in the mid 1980s. And it has been used for the past couple decades to describe the condition of folks who oftentimes end up dying in police custody, where those deaths are rooted in either psychological distress or substance abuse, but also a continuous factor in these deaths is police restraint of some kind in those examples, in those deaths, in those incidents. It's important to note that it has not been recognized by the American Mental Association, the American Psychiatric Association, the World Health Organization. It's not in the DSM, which details, psychological and psychiatric ailments. A 2020 fairly thorough case review that I came across found that it was most often fatal in the presence of aggressive forms of police restraint, including hog tying, manhandling, pressing folks to the ground, using tasers repeatedly. It is welcomed as a diagnosis, and it's used as a diagnosis by medical examiners, and it's also accepted within the emergency medical field with EMTs, with emergency room doctors and nurses. So it sort of shows you which groups of people are using it and which larger groups are not accepting it. It's generally diagnosed in the absence of other confirmed causes of death. And it's most often diagnosed for young male African-American men who use cocaine and are in police custody. This is what the literature was showing me that I looked at. I think that's a good enough summary, and I'll probably hit a little bit more. But for myself, when I first read this article in the Washington Post in the summer of 2020, I almost lost my mind. I read this concept and I was like, what is this? How have I never heard of this? And how dare they pathologize a normal human reaction to running into the police, especially for Black and brown people with the history that we have, and the very high likelihood that you will be harmed or killed by the police. It's so clearly adopted through a white lens, erasing history, erasing white supremacy, erasing our entire system. It's assuming a normal baseline white experience that you will respond this certain way to the police, and which is just completely outrageous. And yeah, I'm still sort of struggling. I did look up some more recent research, and it looks like the American Medical Association has started to push back. There are doctors from prestigious schools and prestigious universities and teachers and lecturers who are pushing back more recently. And I do think it's because of this wave of awakening for folks since the summer of 2020. I hope that it continues. It's unfortunate that it's taken so many deaths. And again, the potential for the police officers in George Floyd's murder to use that as a reason for their behavior and for their murdering that man. It's something that I'm interested in learning more about. And it also it really reflects our history of medicalized racism, this imperviousness to pain, this like superhuman strength. It's this idea that someone might have this condition, and so therefore we have to respond more aggressively to them, which then is just a paradox and just a repeating, just a cycle around and around, where the folks who are coming into contact with the police really don't have a fighting chance. And I guess I'll open it to others. I don't know sort of what the next step is.
Julia, Betsy?
That is a wild one. It is, it's actually terrifying to think about how this country continues to kind of move the goalposts and make something reputable, especially in a time we're seeing right now. We'll talk about this a little bit later, but just the lack of nuance in wanting to discuss these things. It's kind of what they're doing with like critical race theory, right? Like if we erase the history, if we don't talk about it, it doesn't exist. And so it once again normalizes kind of, what white people's experiences. So of course the baseline is like, hey, well, you see the police, this is how you normally act. Like you see this on Fox News where they'll talk about, Black and brown people being pulled over by the police and their fear. They'll be like, well, like I was pulled over by the police and I just told them, I had a gun in my thing I was holding and nothing happened to me. Like, why would you act up? And it's like the complete lack of how you live your life and what you're able to do is not what I'm able to do or someone who looks like me is able to do. And that only comes when we honestly ignore, when we intentionally ignore the history of this country. And it's also another way of us kind of, I think, improving the look of police. That like, the police is Mr. Friendly, they're supposed to be helping us. They can't be scary. It's so many just interwoven like things that are happening there that are very, very scary.
I think some things that I'm thinking about are, one, just understanding that, medical institutions, a lot of times in our society, I think it's easy to have this underlying assumption that they're operating on a basis of science and, really being conscious of holding them accountable for what's actually scientifically supported and what isn't. This really reminded me a lot of, some of the scientific racism of the 19th century and 18th century, that, it's science. We've done these studies. And if you have some type of quantitative data or, scientific sounding language, that then you can often, try to use that when it's really what you're doing, right, is saying, we as white people have this institutional power and this is how we can use it, is to make, promulgate this theory. So, I'm thinking a lot about that and the many ways that manifests in medical institutions. And I did a training as an emergency medical technician in 2021, and this was in my textbook. And, I was thinking just a lot about how, so this as EMT training, you are taught that you listen to the police keep people safe, the police are you answer to. And there's no ethical standard around putting the interests of a patient before what the police tell you to do. Right? If the police tell you to let that person lay there and bleed, that's what you're supposed to do. So I think, understanding that particularly among emergency response, it's very, very strongly integrated with the police. And that's obviously something that is going to be, prevent there from being just and equitable care, given to people.
I was also going to bring up the fact that I'm glad you made that point about the connection between, of course, like healthcare and healthcare workers and the police in that relationship, because it speaks to what this event is also about, right? That like there's also a connection between journalists or news and the police. There's a relationship there that like automatically, if you notice, when you read newspaper articles or you're watching, like, oh, we spoke to the police, this is what they said. The police said that they're doing this. The police, are telling us to do this. And so that relationship and all this does, this delirium, kind of idea, it fits right into that. So it's like, oh, well, it's science, so therefore it's real, it's proven, it's in a medical book, so therefore it has to be right? And then you have, well, we're the news, and the police, we already have this kind of relationship, and it's backed up by science. It's showing So like these people, they go through this thing. And so this relationship is further cemented. And so I remember when George Floyd happened, and a lot of Black journalists have been talking about this for years, for decades, I'm sure, about how the police cannot be your one and only source when incidents happen. And there's a larger conversation happening that like with George Floyd, we remember the first article that came out about him was like, oh, well, the police came, they locked him up, he went to, he had some kind of like health, situation, and then, he ended up dying when he was at the hospital. If that tape was not taken, we wouldn't have known the true backstory. So like, imagine all of the other kind of stories that don't have the nuance because we trust what the police are saying. So it just kind of furthers this relationship between these different, roles and jobs, news and police, healthcare workers and police. We trust what they say, and there's no nuance given to history, to the relationship that police have with Black and brown people. It all kind of gets muddled. And this is what we get, these are the stories that we get, this kind of lack of nuance.
And it's also the walls and the practices that create the silence that we do not know about, right? The practice that even that this term that has been used and that is on documentation is that formalized by EMTs and police officers, right? That most of the time we don't learn about these things that are hidden until there's like a George Floyd that is murdered and there's a trial and we're digging deep into it, right? That these things are kind of hidden from us. So that's one thing that I want to bring up. And the second is that I wanted to go to the historical piece that takes this term of the excited delirium and actually takes it all the way back to enslavement and talking about, we had just talked about the pronunciation of this, drapatomina. No, I can't say it, Tammy. Drapatomania.
I think drapetomania is what we sort of,
there we go.
Came to consensus-ish on.
And it says the mental illness discovered in 1851 that caused slaves to flee captivity, prescribed treatments were whipping the devil out of them and cutting off their toes and preventing them from running, right? And so we've heard that like enslaved people that wanted to actually escape and wanted to leave their plantations, and that they were crazy for wanting to leave, that the conditions that they were in were great. Why would they not want to be here, right? And the same kind of pseudoscience used from then and still being carried on to now, and trying to normalize the insanity and the ludicrous life that we are living in these systems that are oppressing us as Black people to be as the norm. Why would you act this way? Why would you respond this way? Even though literally our feet are on your neck. Any other thoughts on this one?
I just had a quick note just for myself. When I first read the article, like my gut response was outrage, right? I think when we're looking at news and we're getting those little snippets and we move on to the next thing, we start to turn off our normal human response to what the news means. In addition to taking it at face value and listening to other people, we sort of turn off our own emotional gut response to things, and we often don't follow through on that. And I think that can work to our detriment as well.
Yeah, thank you for saying it. That's very true. Because I think it was an important question that Anthony kind of, when we were kind of doing that meditative period, like, what do you do when you get the news? Like, how do you get it? What is your reaction to it? I grew up in a house where, like, the news was always on, and, certain stories catch your eye, you kind of debate, you ask more questions. But I think that's a part of, like having that kind of rigorous, constant questioning of where we're getting our news, who's telling us this, and what is the point? Like, what is the end goal? And so, the news is supposed to be informing without, any type of political party or, any kind of ulterior motive. But like living in this country where white supremacy is the basis, that is always going to be a part of the motive. And like, it's kind of continuing, people kind of being just knowing and understanding how this country is supposed to work, and that's the point of view that it's told from. So it's important that we question, and we kind of have those gut feelings, those gut reactions.
And you created such a great segue for our next story in talking about motives and what is seen at the front and what is kind of happening behind the scenes and people's ulterior motives. So I'll pass it over to you, Betsy.
Yeah, so I want to talk about the Indian Child Welfare Act, which is a piece of legislation and some current threats to it. So I'm just going to give a little bit of background. So, you know, a lot of people may be aware that one of the many projects of genocide in this country was boarding schools that removed Native children from their homes and brought them to white-led boarding schools in order to, again, try to essentially, you know, wipe out Native people and their culture as one effort to do that. And a kind of second iteration of that after the boarding schools was actually taking Native children from their homes and putting them with white foster parents and that removal. So there was a law passed in the 70s called ICWA, the Indian Child Welfare Act. And this law basically says that if a child with Native, that's a member of a tribe or potentially a member of a Native tribe is removed from their home, there's certain steps that have to be followed, and that the ideal placement for that child is with other Native families, essentially. So that's what it says. So recently, in the past few years, there's been these very high profile cases of some white adoptive parents who have been trying to adopt Native children, or in some cases, have basically been fighting for it. And then there's been a legal battle around whether or not that's legal under ICWA. So there's this sort of like, there's been many white folks who have been making the argument that, essentially ICWA is unfair to white people or unfair to white adoptive families. What's really interesting about this is that there are some really major players that have gotten involved. So the law firm Gibson Dunn, who has represented corporations like Amazon and Walmart, has gotten involved in one of these cases. There's a right-wing think tank called the Goldwater Institute that's pumped a bunch of money into some of these. And so they have been trying to argue that ICWA is racist and it discriminates against white folks, and that actually, because it discriminates against people based on race, it's unconstitutional. Some important background to know about laws, like many different types of laws that impact Native folks and laws around tribal sovereignty, is that it's actually not based on race, it's based on membership in a tribe, which is actually considered a political affiliation, right? So hopefully folks know, right, that tribes are actually considered essentially a sovereign nation that the United States has a nation-to-nation relationship with. So there's this huge funnel of right-wing money that's trying to take down the Indian Child Welfare Act. And they're arguing that, it harms Native children because there's these wonderful white adoptive families that wants to, adopt these Native children. And of course, that, completely erases and dismisses how it's a project of genocide to be taking children of color generally, from their homes and placing them with white adoptive families. But what is really important about this is that in this case, there's a potential, legal scholars have looked at this and said, there's a potential that if they can take down ICWA, if they can argue that ICWA is unconstitutional, the Indian Child Welfare Act, it could set a legal precedent to actually undo tribal sovereignty, right? If that same argument held up in court, it could actually be used to apply to many other laws that around tribal sovereignty. And that could actually pave the way for corporations to have, for instance, to have greater access to minerals and natural resources on reservations. Like that's just one example. It could really undermine tribal sovereignty. And so, this is, I think, something that's really significant in the history of our country right now, right? That it's this law that potentially could have this really far-reaching impact. And I know Dana put those links in the chat. I want to shout out particularly the podcast This Land by Rebecca Nagel, season 2. She has a really deep dive into all of this. But so that's kind of like the overview of it. And I really think that this is so important to understand, because it's really a way to look at, when we talk about an issue, do we talk about power? Do we give an honest and genuine analysis of who has power, who wants something, what are people's motives and interests? Because you can go on the Goldwater Institute, like I said, right-wing think tank, and they'll have a whole thing about how ICWA is harmful to Native children, and it's all about these poor Native children who don't have the opportunity to be adopted by white adoptive parents, which is harmful in its own right. but like I said, it completely is not acknowledging what are the other interests that are at stake here. So that's my take on it.
Julia, Tammy, thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I think that this kind of brings to mind so many things. Of course, that kind of old quote, or I think it's usually kind of attributed to Winston Churchill. So history is written by the victors. It's what in the news is also kind of written the same way. It's written with the end goal of kind of continuing what the country represents. This is extremely insidious on so many levels. It's actually kind of depressing. From the point of view of, for one, just white people having this feeling of ownership over children, and saying, using like religion and the whole kind of I care thing, that getting children away from their cultural families, from their homes, is okay because we're saving them. There's so much like white saviorism that's happening here at the root of this story, and in the kind of deeper context of how this can take more land, how we can continue to harm indigenous populations, is really just it's kind of like the beginning of all of the issues that this country represents and what we do to people. It's just mind blowing.
I wanted to sort of reiterate this idea that white people have all the answers and have all the good things to give to all the people, right? All the right answers. I was struck by something Betsy said in terms of how we define genocide. I focused on international humanitarian law for a while in my life. And I think we get very hung up on the definition of genocide, like an international understanding of what it means to sort of decimate and kill lots of people. But it also looks like so many other things. It looks like displacement. It looks like having children raised by other people that are not their people. And so just us to think about that broadly when we're looking at definitions of things, to really see what it really means. Like what are the root pieces of a concept and how that can manifest in ways that we're not used to seeing, like this concept of genocide.
And that violence is not just the kind of bloody physical violence, but that violence is stealing one's culture. Violence is taking someone away from their families, and like that is violence. And we have a very particular view of violence. And it's not, like you're saying, these other kind of forms of genocide. Thank you for bringing that up.
Yeah, and Betsy, everybody knows I'm a podcast lover. When Betsy was like, "Oh, there's a podcast with it," and I started listening to it, and it really, I've only gotten through one episode, but there's all the layers to it, right? There's the piece of class and white saviorism and Christianity that is there. There is the part where you kind of get into the foster care system and how Hbcu like came to be. And then you have like this background of like right-wing think tank and what's going on with that. But something that really drew me in was learning that Hbcu existed and how it was a way to kind to hold on to culture, to traditions and everything, and that the policy, and that with Hbcu, there are stages that you have to go through for adoption in order to try to keep the child to stay with their community. And so what really struck me as we're talking about violent and then looking different is it tells a story about a child who is placed with a family that is white. And then after a certain amount of time, they decided to change the child's name, right? And so that, and being so violent, right? And right before it in the podcast, it talks about like the meaning of culture and rituals of singing and how they honor, how Native people honor the land. And then for the family to just be like, we're just going to change the child's name. And not only to be harming that, but also as a disconnect that it's harder for you to then find the child and locate. And so I'm thinking about all of that in the different ways that we talk about violence and genocide in this. Yeah, I'm going to stop there. It was painful. Other thoughts, Betsy?
Well, thanks everyone for adding all of that. And yeah, like just everyone has said, that there's just so many different layers of harm, right, that are happening there. And I didn't say this as much, but Anthony, you touched on it, just that yeah, one of the things that's interesting is how the white adoptive family, they talk about how in their evangelical church that actually, being foster parents and adopting is something that's really that's been preached, that is, part of God's mission for them. And, it's really paralleling that civilized and Christianized, like, that we somehow, for some reason, some people think is a thing of the past, which clearly isn't. And it's just like a new, version of that. And it's like the fact that it's acceptable, right? To the minds of so many white folks, it's acceptable for a white family to just take a child of color and raise that child of color is then being used by the right wing as a strategy to, like I said, undermine tribal sovereignty in other ways, right? Because if everyone would be outraged by the idea of white families taking Native children, then this actually wouldn't be a good strategy to try to undermine tribal sovereignty. And it's only because that there's this, like you said, sort of deeply entrenched savior mentality idea that, white families are just the best place for the children of color, that this is the strategy that they're choosing to try to undermine tribal sovereignty more generally.
And I want to speak a name to the fact that, like, oftentimes that this practice is done of white families in a very, like, Christian way and savior complex way is directed at children of color, right? We're not having a conversation about them adopting other white children, right? It is often that I have to adopt children of color in order to show how good of a person and how holy I am. So go ahead, Julia.
I was gonna make 2 points. For one, this reminds me, it's reminiscent of the event that we did, I think, a couple years ago, where we talked about adopting Asian children and how, historically, like, taking kids from Asia, them not having any kind of connection or knowing their families, and then bringing them to the U.S. and raising them essentially as, like, young white children when they are in fact Asian. So taking away their cultural names, not talking to them about their culture, why they look different than, like, everybody else in maybe the middle of, like, a predominantly white small town. Like, those things are kind of like reminiscent of that. But then also, when we think about the fact that, this has come up a lot, that by a few years, white people will not be the dominant, quote unquote, race in America. And, like, what this does, like, I think a lot of people sometimes when talking about white supremacy and colonialism and racism, we think that it's really about numbers. Like, it's about, oh, well, the white people, like, if they're no longer the majority, then they no longer have the power. And this is where that power analysis is so important. By taking children of color away from their families, you are essentially repatriating them. They don't have to look like you, but they have to think like you. And so that's what you do when you erase their name. That's when you don't connect them to their cultural histories. You are telling them that the way that I look and the way that I live, the way that I think is the right way of thinking. So then you get politicians who are of color who end up continuing to spout out these kind of, like, white supremacist ideas that continue to practice and live their lives this way. So, like, there's the insidiousness of trying to take indigenous folks' land and children, but then also almost like turning them, turning them against their people, that also continues this kind of white supremacist ideology.
Thank you.
I think the last thing I would just add after, hearing you say that, Julia, and just to put it in like similar terms, is just, when we think about white supremacy and colonialism as this project of taking things, right? Taking all kinds of resources that aren't ours. And it's like, it didn't stop with land and wealth and labor, right? And it's also children, right? It's actually taking people's actual children and they're, so yeah.
And then, okay, one last thing, because we gotta get to the other one. Also, the way that the children are used as bargaining chips, right? As well in that, and it gets into that more in the podcast, and we've also seen that throughout history, right? So I'll just leave that there. And go to our third one with Julia. Go ahead.
All right. So when I did my introduction, I mentioned that I am a proud HBCU graduate. I attended Morgan State University. So this story is, and this, what's going on is very close to my heart, as my school was affected, as well as, fellow HBCU campuses. So since February, what I'll say is that this story really came up last week when Black History Month started, that there have been HBCU bomb threats that have been going across the country, in Baltimore, in the District of Columbia. And so they have been calling schools, threatening saying it is a bomb. And what actually happens, of course, these campuses are put on lockdown. Students are told to shelter in place. Campus, they're working with investigators to figure out what's going on, whether this is actually real or this just is like, a joke, someone's a cool joke to these schools. So far, thank goodness, no explosions have actually happened. But while the story itself has been talked about in the media, what I really wanted to kind of get into is how the nuance, or rather the lack of nuance, around discussing this story in the news. We hear about a bomb threat, it sounds awful, HBCUs, it's Black History Month, and that's kind of like where a lot of it has kind of ended. It's like, oh, there was no bombings, there was no explosions, we're working with folks, they're saying it's a prank. But it does not get into how this is a part of a long-term history, right, of white supremacist violence and terrorism. And so the harm that's actually being done to HBCUs and its students and its workers, administrators, is a form of, anti-Black violence and terrorism. And that is something that has got to be a part of the story. So a nuance needed. As we kind of look at our country right now, we have the bombings, we have this kind of debate about critical race theory and how, it doesn't need to be taught in schools. Obviously, didn't even bring up the fact that, for one, critical race theory is a legal theory. And most of us were not, learning about critical race theory in grade school. But what we're actually talking about is history. It is ignoring the history of this country. It is ignoring and whitewashing how this country was formed, the violence that happened, the genocide that happened, and that continues to be baked into the laws and the policies that we have normalized, and we kind of just say, this is just our lives. So by not talking more about HBCU bomb threats and its connection to white supremacy, very rarely when I heard it on MSNBC or any other news channel did I hear someone say, this is connected to how we want to whitewash this country. It's connected to the erasure of critical race theory and history in schools. It is erasing the Black experience of dealing with, constant trauma and fear of death when just trying to go to school, trying to better themselves, trying to learn about, what's going to help them, get a job. It is a mechanism of racial control. It is about the kind of the mental and the physiological, trauma that is happening to students, on campuses that a school that supports them and teaches them about their history. And if we lose that nuance, it is a part of just the continuing erasure. And that, for one, in comparison to other news stories, like when we, of course, obviously had, anti-Asian hate, when we saw synagogues being bombed, it's usually this kind of connection with others, anti-Semitism. And nobody would debate that. That's true and it's awful. But that HBCU bomb threats are not just bomb threats. They are a continuance of harm towards Black people and having them trying to shorten what they can do to better themselves, get their education, learn about themselves. And that is harm that is not being connected in the stories. I really want to kind of hear people's thoughts. What were their feelings, of course, when they heard this news? Yeah.
I think one thing that I, just was thinking a lot about is like, so how do you think the average white person would react if this happened at Yale and Harvard? Like, what would that look like? It would be completely different. And I feel like that really illustrates the dehumanization of Black people, in our society, because, in the minds of white folks, that would be a completely different thing that's occurring. And so I've just been thinking a lot about that, and how this really demonstrates not just racism, but really specifically anti-Blackness, is such an illustration of it, how this is being discussed, and all the points you raised. So those are some of my thoughts.
I was going to add to that and wonder if those other institutions would sort of like dismiss it, if it'd be more easily dismissible as a real threat, because there's not that history of violence in that way. So it'd be an easier thing to just like set aside. Is this real? Do I really have to evacuate? Do I really have to go hide? Like, what, really? And the flip side is that I really feel like every time this word prank or joke comes up, it should be taken down immediately, because with the history of violence against Black and brown folks in this country over 400 years, no threat can ever be seen as a prank. It just cannot, because it's real harm every single time. And so to even let those words come out of your mouth, even one little bit, that it might be just a prank, or like it cannot be. It just cannot be. It is a real threat every single time.
So at this point, I have given up and being like, I'm moderating. I'm just gonna be a panelist, because each time y'all say something, I'm like, I gotta say something. And Betsy, when you gave the example of it was Harvard or Yale, my eyes got big when you said it. Like, I automatically had a reaction to it, right? And it would the narrative would be totally different, because what I have not heard that I think we would be hearing if it was a Harvard or Yale are who are the potential suspects, what are the leads, where is this going? And what I have seen, I have just seen that, again, it is all clear, nothing has exploded, there's nothing to worry about, but the heightened, we need answers, we got to get to the bottom of it. Like, the public needs to know would be there if it was one of these prestigious white universities that we're not hearing from an HBCU. So, and then the other thing that I want to name too is, you talked about it some, but I just want to explicitly name just the generational trauma that is there, right? Of Black people trying to get their education, whether that have been elementary schools and integrating schools, and there being violence, to HBCUs having threats before. I had read an article about a young woman who said that my grandparents went through this, right? And so just the generational trauma of trying to be in a safe space and get an education, and just to be shrugged and be like, so.
Yeah, and I also want to kind of connect it, because it kind of made me think, Tammy's story about what is it called, about the delirium, like what you just kind of mentioned, that reaction. That, when Black people, maybe when white people interact with the cops, it is completely different than maybe when Black and brown people interact with the cops, right? It's the same thing. So when you're, threatening a school, and that school, as long as it just happens to be HBCUs, like as I mentioned before, it wasn't like all the schools in Maryland or college campuses across the nation were being called. It was specifically, right, HBCUs. Some of these schools have been getting bomb threats since January, and we're literally just hearing about it in February, and like getting multiple calls. Like Spelman, I think, has been called a few times. This is a part of, oh, it's a prank, it's a joke. We can't live in that reality. That's not our reality. Our reality is when someone is calling and say we're gonna blow up your school, our images in our brain are of our ancestors before us, who were harassed, who were threatened, who were bombed. And so there is no like space for prank, right? It's like, I think I mentioned to you all, a prank is, I put a whoopee cushion under your seat before you sit down. It is not, I call and say I'm gonna blow up your house. It's two different things. And so that kind of, like lack of urgency is really, really telling in how we even report the news, and what this does to the students, the families of those students, the people who work there, what it does to them. It's not for them to learn. it's likely for them to work, that is terrifying. And so I just, of course, send my love all to my HBCUs. I hope that they are doing okay.
Another thing that I'm thinking about, when we were talking, with ICWA, right, about how, right, like taking children from their homes and their family, right, is a form of genocide. And so that, this is really like preventing young people from being able to access an education in their community, right? And it's actually very similar, right? That if you're making it unsafe for them to learn within their community, like how is that not also a form of genocide, So yeah, just really, really thinking about that.
And this whole like stopping Black folks from learning, going all the way back to slavery and what was prohibited and what was punished severely, and what the limitations were on who could learn and how much to have influence. And so, right, back to power.
So we've had a chance to look at these, analyze these 3 current events. There are definitely threads here. Maybe there's one in particular that you want to talk about, or you have questions or comments about some of the threads. You can either raise your hand, or you can put your comment in the chat, or we can call on you. You can come on video and come off mute to ask your questions. Sometimes it's a lot to try to type in. I know there was some chat activity while we were talking. So we'll open the floor for that right now. Anybody have questions or comments they want to make?
I'll make a comment, and I'll put it in the chat in terms of that delirium and aggressive reaction to the police. Well, Breonna Taylor was sleeping, so was Amir Locke. So how do you rationalize and justify an aggressive behavior towards the police as a reason for dying? They were asleep in their beds, so it's not squaring up. Well, it's irrational anyway, and we know that. But that's just an example of that's not going to work. And in terms of the statement about white families adopting children of color, this reminds me of Colin Kaepernick's white family. Oh, they completely, if you saw that documentary that was done, they completely tried to make him not honor who he was, to the point where he had to cut his hair because it was, and when he went to a prom with a Black girl, the mother didn't put the picture up, but then when he went to the prom for a white girl, she put the picture up. So it was very evident that they were not trying to help him develop into an African-American young man. But those are just 2 of the points that, you all talked about that came to my mind.
Thank you. Good, Tammy.
Yeah, is it Janaba? Is that how you say it? Dajanaba. I was thinking about your first comment and the comment you put in the chat, and just thinking back to the purpose of policing in this country has always been to control Black bodies, right? So just thinking common threads, looking at the excited delirium diagnosis, and then at folks who've been killed when they're sleeping or doing nothing more than living their lives in their own homes, right? Police officers, police officers being trained to be afraid, being trained to use force, understanding that they have very limited accountability, right? These like common threads that we just see through either excited delirium or just generally in interactions when people are killed. And yeah, just sort of all the different excuses and all the levels of latitude that are given to certain people and not other folks in those interactions.
And something that I'm thinking about right now and I'm going to keep doing the excited delirium, as we should, as it's not a real thing, is the things that they are describing about the behavior and the interaction with a police officer. You could, right now I'm in my brain looking at that, it specifies this as being Black people and like their behavior with police officers. But like, why wouldn't that same similar behavior be tagged on to like the barbecue Becky when a police officer comes and has a total fit and a total meltdown, right? That is racialized, that it could be the same behavior, but it has to be a Black person, that it then has this pseudo science to it that is interesting.
Right, which then ignores the historical, sociological impact of why different people would respond differently when the police come upon them, right? It just erases all of that.
Mhm.
And I think we had kind of talked about it before, just like that connection between like this kind of pseudoscience that even now folks are unlearning, like Black people don't feel pain. Black people, when this happens to them, like, their reactions are different. And it's like, it's just kind of the complete lack of nuance and reality of why these things are. Why do people act differently? Why do Black people act differently? It's kind of astonishing considering, the larger story that we tell ourselves in this country, that racism is not happening, and we know that it is, and it just kind of continues to be whitewashed. Like, no, it's like they have, this special disease. That's not what it is. Like that, it's just constant.
Thanks so much for that point. Other questions, comments?
Well, I think either Betsy or Tammy said it, that the whole thing is that Black folks, you have done something wrong, and we're here as white people to correct your behavior. So no matter what it is, you've done something wrong, and we're here to correct you, because the example that white people set is the one that should be modeled, should be the one that should be imitated, should be the one that should be absorbed. And this has been throughout history. So, do as I say, not as I do, discount all the other atrocities that they've heaped upon each other in Europe and in many other places. But it's like, don't believe your lying eyes, bottom line, just believe what I say. And because white is right, you must have done something wrong. I mean, that's what I've always seen when or noticed when we're listening to the news or anything else. And I think what news we listen to has a lot to do with how we absorb things also. That local news to me is not intent enough. Personally, I listen to Democracy Now!, BBC News, Christiane Amanpour, and PBS NewsHour, because there's more in-depth interviews, more the topics are explored longer, and it gives you more of an in-depth approach to what is going on. And they will talk about what's popular, but the whole approach is differently. I used to only look at local news, and then I realized, no, that I don't need a 15-second soundbite on something important. I need to hear more, and those news stations give that to me.
Thank you for bringing that up, because I was also going to say, a lot of the news, one of the things, I think is actually important, the question that Anthony asked in the beginning, what happens when you listen to the news? Like, where are you getting it from? How are you feeling? How are you interacting and engaging with the information that you're receiving? Are you asking other questions? Like, I've started to begin to ask, what is the end goal of telling this story this way? Right? Because I mean, like, for one, it's said that I have to ask that question, but what does this, when I receive this information, what am I supposed to be taking from this? Right? One of the other stories that I was going to talk about, that we could stop, who knows, we can talk about it in a few months, but was the fact that Marilyn Mosby was on Joy Reid like a week or so ago, talking about her case. And I had to ask myself, now here I am from Baltimore, Maryland. I know the history of Marilyn Mosby. I see what she has done, like, kind of like touted as this kind of democratic progressive who is trying to change the way Black and brown people specifically are being treated, and with the justice system, the legal system. And I also can hold in my head that what she's doing to specifically keep Davis Jr. in his case is not really lining up with what she's being, doing, or kind of how she's being purported on the news. And yet no one asked her about that. Now, I'm a fan of Joy Reid. I've watched her for years, but that made me sit and question, what is the ultimate motive of this interview with her? And so we have to do that with all of our news. What is being told and what's not being told?
if somebody from a local spot, like a Baltimore mayor or New York mayor is being praised in national media, I want to hear what the people from that town have to say about that person, because there's always a story that's not being told, and so the motivations have to be questioned. So listening to news where alternative kind of voices are being heard is important. So one of the things I listen to Democracy Now! As well. NPR stuff usually has some other balanced points of view, and sometimes stories that I don't hear about nationally. But also, Morgan has a radio station, 88.9, WGAA 88.9. I may not agree with everything, but it does give me a good introduction into what people are thinking on different topics, big and small, local and national. And so making sure that you're also supporting news that has that is going to be important too.
I'm curious, actually, out of the three kind of current events that we talked about with ICWA, with the excited Delirium, and with the HBCU bomb threats, how many of those other people had heard of before we got on the line today? Could you put in the comments if it's like 3? I heard of all 3 before this. I only heard 1, 0. Could people put those in the chat? 1 out of 3, 1.
And which ones? I would be curious to hear as well.
2. I agree. Could you put in the chat which ones? Bomb threats. Hadn't heard of Delirium. 2, the ICWA and the bomb threats. About all 3. Okay, kind of mixed. And I know about ICWA. Where are the other 2? Only HBCU bomb threats. Only HBCUs. Bomb threats. Okay. I mean, this says a lot. This says about the it even is the exercise. Maybe we have to do this. There was a special workshop that we were going to do with BRJA on analyzing news, right? And so a lot of our public workshops was on, when you continue your learning, how are you making sure that you're ingesting, good news and that you're critiquing it? And how do you build that up? And the questions that Julie are asking, how do you ask the right questions, figure out what people we so often depend on people being like, hey, I am affiliated this way, and then just listen and just follow. But it's how do you grapple and understand with what their position is and what yours does and how that fits into an anti-racist, anti-oppression lens. And so we were thinking of doing that for a workshop, and how do you analyze and figure out what is the good news, and what are the further questions you need to ask and more things that you need to investigate. And so maybe we need to put that closer to the hopper for us to work on. Excited Delirium, not as much as the other news. Okay. Time has winded down. I'm gonna pass it to panelists. Any other thoughts or comments?
I had heard of all 3,
Okay.
but that's so minimal. And I heard probably once on each of them, except for maybe the HBCUs. I heard that more than once. And I never heard, even in some of the best places of getting news, I never heard a historical context that really got into the kinds of issues we've been talking about here. And the sort of thread that runs through it all is what the panelists all referred to, which is everything is through a white worldview lens. And as long as that's the case, we're never going to get the kind of information we really need to understand and to make good judgments.
And maybe add a lens of a white male. Has a lot to do with it.
Yeah.
Especially as our news continues to be, it's really connected to what people, the news is not just the news, it's really a popularity contest. So it kind of reminds me when MSNBC had the most Black journalists at one point, but it was during Obama's presidency. And as soon as that started winding down, it was well, we no longer need these other these Black journalists. We just need to, let's figure out, let's try to get some Republican, like some Fox News people on here, and their shows all failed. Like, because for one, like, obviously MSNBC is a lot more like liberal kind of, democratic kind of point of view, but that, like, it's really about the time. It's not about the information. It's about who's saying what. And that's the problem, that it's not just, like, oh, well, it's a Black person, so now we have a Black person talk about it. It's about all of us really kind of investigating and being intentional on how we discuss the information that we get as a country. And this goes into, granted, whether you agree with voting or not, they always say, an informed electorate is able to make the best decisions. And it just kind of speaks the world over that continuously, the information that we receive as Americans about this country, about other countries, about what's happening around the world, it robs all of us of being, I think, true citizens and engaging in what it means to be a citizen of this country. It's supposed to be about togetherness and us kind of learning about each other. That's not happening on the news front. And it's important to really investigate that personally and as a country.
The news has become like a game show, and they're about ratings, and that's why they give you these 15-second sound bites about something. Oh, you heard it here first. It's ridiculous. And I don't need that. The stations I named give me much more in-depth coverage of a topic, and that's what I want. That's what I need.
Betsy, Tammy.
And also, before we end, one last point, and also, who has access to what news is also another question. I have found that a lot of quote unquote liberal news kind of sections, they have like a paper, they're behind a paywall. So even the information that we do need to know and care about is not as readily accessible as the news that honestly maybe we shouldn't, or the news that really doesn't make that much sense. Who has access is also a really important question and thing to think about.
Tammy, Betsy, final thoughts?
I think just, thinking as I watch news or engage with news, of thinking like, what is the impact of telling this story this way? Like whatever the lens is, whatever the framing is, what is the impact of that, and how does it uphold or dismantle the current power structure that's in place, and the current white supremacist structure that's in place.
And I was going to say that it just got me thinking a bit of what Julia was saying, where like white folks have individual perspectives, but then folks of color are sort of seen as a monolith in terms of how they look at life, or how they're going to examine an issue, and being really careful to discern your news sources, who you're hearing from, what the message is, and not just taking something at face value because you get it from this location, or the person looks like this, or they're talking about this topic. Just being really analytical yourself in how you're taking in that information.
And before I pass it out, I see two kind of comments in the chat. I lost it. Paula says, "Oh, to return to the days of Walter Cronkite." And Dana says, "But those old days were constantly from a white frame." Paula asking to explain. And then Paula, you said, "Oh, true. Walter I can't say his name. Cronkite told what was happening without sensationalizing it." Any other thoughts from those engaged in that? That was Dana, Paula, Gail.
Yeah, I was thinking maybe Walter Cronkite, if he had an anti-racist, anti-oppression lens in how he reported the news. I mean,
I'm not familiar with him, so I don't have anything to add to this.
And he didn't, that is just so rare, no matter who's reporting the news. That is so rare. It's not allowed, for one thing, under the sort of standards of journalism. It almost eliminates the possibility of using a racial justice lens.
Right, because we get back to the whiteness as the default, and anything that veers from that is biased. Right.
And then someone had said the CEO of WYPR is an African-American male. What effect will that have? Can you say more about that, Susan? I'm not sure what the question is in there.
What's the question?
I'm wondering if he will attract, in his tenure, he'll attract more African-American listeners to WYPR, because currently I don't think too many of them are. And when we hear their voices, the more we hear their voices, the better it will be. The more information we'll have.
Well, be real clear, Susan, just because someone's Black doesn't mean I believe them. Just because
Yeah.
Black person doesn't mean I'm gonna believe them. I don't know who they're being controlled by.
Mhm.
I mean, that's
Yes, I was.
oh, they got Black person on there. That made me, no, not anymore. Not for me. And not for a lot of folks anymore. No, you got to come right, as the kids say, because you Black.
Mhm.
You have to have more on the ball than that. You have to have a sense of what's important to Black folks, regardless. And if you're not coming across like that, the mere fact that you open your mouth because you got dark skin or melanin doesn't mean anything to me.
Thank you. And I think that you bring up the
Yeah,
point of,
I was gonna say that. Yeah.
yeah, that we historically have seen Black people being propped and put in positions
Mhm.
to just be the symbolization, but not to actually have the substance, as we talked about, the symbolization, but not the
Exactly.
substance. And I think it goes back to a little bit of what Julia was saying, is what is the intent? What's
Mhm.
happening behind the scenes? Because as we also talk about these people in the stories that are the characters and what are their motives, but that is also the same for these industries that are given our media and our news, right? That the stories that are cut, the things that are taken out of the stories, those are decided by individuals. And just because those individuals may be Black, does that mean that it's also always going to be used from an anti-racist, anti-oppression lens? It's not always going to be used with the priority being on social justice. Other panelists' thoughts on that?
Yes, I wanted to
Yeah.
apply that to police officers as well, because I think a lot of folks look at police and like, well, it couldn't have been that because the officer was Black or he was Latino, and so I'm sure it wasn't that. And so just wanted to make that real clear in this space, for sure.
Yeah.
Right. I think that if anything, go ahead, please, Betsy.
Oh, just yeah. I mean, I think another good way to think about it for white folks is like, it can be such an easy out for us as white folks, to be like, well, this Black person said that, or they have this Black journalist, and I think it's really having to go deeper in our analysis. And yeah, I love what Rebecca put in the chat, like people of any race can be having a whiteness lens, but having that eye towards a deeper understanding to then get past that superficial, well, Black people are monoliths, so if there's a Black person on this show, then that's that, so.
And that one of the things I was going to say is that it speaks to, and I think I've had this convo with like Michelle and Anthony about the limits of representation. Representation is important, but just like I was talking about with the kind of like repatriation of Indigenous children into white supremacy, it's not just about the having them, it's about the thought. How are they thinking? How are they interpreting? And so asking that question, if you're reading an article from the Washington Post, you have to think about what is the goal of the Washington Post? Who is this writer? What is their background? All of that kind of, information is influencing and distorting, or it's a prism into how they view the world and what they think their ultimate goal is in telling that story. And so we have to question constantly and rigorously amongst each other and the information that we're getting, because the news is a part of, unfortunately, it's a part of our legal system. It's a part of our country and how we make decisions. It's a quote my dad used to say when he was in the Army, that a lot of the the Americans, we are the smartest, most kind of like educated dumb people in the world. that we have all of this media, all of this information, and all of this quote unquote access, but that we truly don't know. We're in a bubble. And so it's not until you try to burst that bubble for yourself by doing the extra work, unfortunately, of asking more questions and getting other points of view, that you start to kind of think more broadly about the system that we're living in, and what its actual goal is.
So just like we started, I kind of want to end us with like a guided, like closing our eyes a little bit and taking some breaths. So let's go ahead, close your eyes, do a little bit of breathing.
Yeah.
I want you to think about maybe 1 or 2 points that were made today that you are going to carry throughout your week. Carry with you the next time that you see some news. And also want you to carry that and fill the space, fill your space that you're visualizing. And we talked a lot about what we are not getting from the news that we listen to, that we see. Fill that space with what you would like. Fill the space of what we want to see. Including some of the things that we mentioned: power dynamics, representation, analysis. And now let's open our eyes. One of our founders, Avis Ransom, used to always encourage us to do more dreaming. And so as we spend a little bit of time of dreaming and thinking about what that would look like, I want us to move from a just dreaming space to realizing that our dreams can be the reality, can be a thing that is soon. As Julia had named, all the access, all the resources that we have, all the brilliant minds that we have, that it can materialize, right? And it happens with groups like us that are curious, that want to learn more, that are thirsting for and need a platform and avenues where this happen. These already exist, right? And so I want us to leave with that. All the things that we're saying that we wish would happen, we want more, we want to see more of, we're breathing in and out that we're going to find those things, that we're going to be in collaboration with those people that are doing that work. That's what I want us to leave with and hold on to as we're in our today, where it's just not quite there yet, right? We don't have all the things that we need, but we're holding on to what we know that it can be. I want to thank you all for joining us for 13th today on a Sunday, and I'm gonna pass it to you, Julia, to do our closing announcements.
Great. So just a reminder, for one, like as Anthony said, thank you all for coming today. We have these events every 13th of the month. Please make sure if you're interested in donating, you join us at bemoreantiracist.org/donate to become either a monthly sustainer or make a one-time donation. Follow us on Facebook at Baltimore Social Justice Action, and follow us on Instagram as well as on YouTube at Be More Anti-Racist or at Be More Racial Justice Action. So for our next event, we may not know the title just yet, but that will come out on our social media and our email. So make sure you sign up for that as well. Thank you so much for joining us, and I hope that you enjoy the rest of your Sunday.
I also want to give a quick plug to our short takes, which are videos that we do on some current events about once a month, and we post it to our YouTube. So you can check those out. That's usually myself, Julia, and Michelle doing those. So you can check out short takes. And then, the topic for next month is about innocence not being afforded to Black children. We don't have a official topic yet, but that is what it's about. So we hope to see you all there.
What is it?